Before we get back to the lesson planning template, I just wanted to point out something else about Smartboard resources at Smart Exchange. You can see here that if you look at everything that's in Smart Exchange, there's more than 53,000 items here. Now there's a lot of small stuff in here. You can narrow this down. There are more than 21,000 smart notebook lessons that have been developed in here. The thing is, with Smartboard, you need to use this software called Notebook, and you may be familiar with it or you may not. Even if you don't have a Smartboard yet, you can review these resources by downloading the Notebook program. I think you can get it as it's a trial version. You can download it. Once it's installed on your computer, then you can download any of these resources in Smart Exchange and take a look at the full version of the resources, and everything will work just like it works on a smartboard, except for the fact that you don't have a touch screen on your computer, so you can't just touch things with your finger and have them do something. You need to use your cursor to do that, but everything should work exactly as it does on a smartboard. You can review the resources, make your decisions about what's appropriate for your lesson plans, the kinds of things you want your students to be seeing and doing, and it's a great resource, and it does pretty much address this issue with getting at the different literacies. Okay, let's go back to the lesson template. We mentioned that you're going to be putting in your standards for each lesson and writing your objectives for each of those before you fill out the main part of the lesson. Now I say before, but I'm pretty sure you read somewhere in the textbook about backwards designing, and this is a very common approach that teachers use these days. Basically, the idea is you start with what you want to get. In other words, what do you want to have as your end result or end product from a lesson, and then you plan backwards from there. It's very common approach these days, very effective approach, because you're starting with what you know you want to get. And maybe you want to start figuring out your assessment as your first step in the lesson planning process, and then move back maybe when you figured out what you're going to do to assess to get what you wanted to get, work on those objectives that direct that assessment. Now, I mentioned before that the first thing I look at when I evaluate lesson plans are the objectives. I look for very good, very specific, active term objectives. The next thing I look at is your assessment. I want to see that each of your objectives are being assessed, that you're checking to see that your students have learned what you want them to learn about in this lesson. I'll come back to that in a second. Let's go back to the components of the lesson plan. We talked about the anticipatory set, what you're going to say or do to hook your students into that lesson. The next section here says explanation. Don't think that this means that you're going to be just talking to your students. This is the section that deals with what the students or concepts or skills are going to be learning in this lesson, and that's what they need to understand and how you're going to go about doing that. There's a modeling section. Modeling is considered a very effective teaching strategy. So you're not just teaching something, but you're going through a process that models how the students are understanding what it is you want them to understand. And again, you're going to explain what your strategies are and then the steps that the students are taking to go through this understanding. Then there's a check for understanding. What are you doing to check, or what are the students doing to show that they understand what's going on? Now, this is in the middle of a lesson plan, and when we talk about assessment, we're really talking about a formative assessment situation. Anytime you check for understanding, it's formative assessment. There are a variety of ways of doing that. It can be very simple, just asking students questions to see how they're answering. It can be you just observing what the students are doing, listening to what the students are saying. guided practice, and this is what you're doing to sort of take the students through a process, to show them the way, in other words. And again, there's a check for understanding. Take a look at the sample. The sample is very brief, but it gives you some sense of the different parts of this kind of lesson plan. The next section here is small group methods. We emphasize having students work in small groups. We know from a lot of research that's been done that students will learn more from working in groups with their peers than they learn from what the instructor is telling them, what the teacher is telling them. That's just the way it is. They do learn more in those situations. It's not a simple process to get students set up to work effectively in groups. It's something that takes time to do, especially if they're not used to working in groups. Group work doesn't mean that one person in the group's doing the work and the others are not. Each person in the group, each individual has a role, and this needs to be emphasized in group work. Everybody has a part to play, everybody does their part, and everybody gets evaluated for their contribution to the group work. Opportunities to relearn. This is something that you're doing to check if there's something that's not quite working the way it should. Some students are getting it, some aren't. Then how are you going to check to see and get them to relearn that process or skill? Besides the group learning situation, in lessons we often have independent work. What are the students doing that requires them to work independently and do things on their own? And then back to assessment. Now this section on assessment is sort of a pull-out. Teaching and assessment, learning and assessment all go together hand in hand. It's a continuous process. But this section sort of is a way of showing that you are checking students' understanding during the lesson. That's the formative assessment. And any lesson, you need to check to make sure that students have learned what you wanted them to learn. So if you have an objective here, then you're going to have an assessment. In most cases, at the end of a lesson, you're going to be checking to see that they've met those objectives, and you're going to be measuring how they've done that, and that's your summative assessment. The last part of a lesson is closure. It says closure bridge. We use closure as a way of, it's not really a summary of the lesson. You're not just going to repeat what is learned, but it is in a way of reminding students of what it is that has happened during that lesson. It's basically what you say to the students, or what you have them say to you at the end of a lesson. And it can be a simple statement. Very often teachers use this as a bridge to what's coming next. For example, you would say something like, well, today we learned, and then whatever it was that they are supposed to have learned, and we're going to use this understanding what we learned today when we go on to our next lesson tomorrow, which is about, and then you can bridge into that, what that next lesson is going to do and how they might use that learning in that lesson. Now, the last two sections here, the materials section, basically it's just a listing of the materials that are used in the lesson and resources that you've used for this lesson. That's very simple. Accommodations is a very important section in this lesson plan. You need to deal with your differentiated instruction here. Now, this looks very simple, but this is where you're going to go back and look at your 30 students, and you're going to discuss how you're accommodating those 30 students during instruction. You're going to state in here what you're doing for your language learners. You're going to state in here what you're doing for your special needs students. Again, as the students are going through the lessons and they're all going through at the same time, there's going to be different ways that you want to work with your different students to help them through the process. If you're working with language learners, you need to incorporate perhaps more visual information in the instruction. Visual information is good for all students, but for students who don't have very strong language abilities, English language, then you need more of that kind of thing. Your special needs students, I've mentioned, your ADD students, what accommodations are you going to have in this lesson for them? Be very specific to the lesson here. There's a tendency sometimes for these statements in here to be very generic that could apply to any lesson, but focus on this particular lesson and how you're accommodating each of your different learning needs situations for each of those students. It might be a good idea to even break this down by putting the types of needs in here and then telling how you're dealing with those students. So whatever it is you're doing to accommodate those students, you might have a little section in here on each of those different needs. If you have any questions about this, be sure and ask. If you're not sure about what you need to do to accommodate different types of students, again, those are good questions to ask as you go through the lesson planning process. Okay, that's it for now.